The fluorescent lights hummed above the nurse's station at Sacred Heart Hospital, and Margaret Walsh moved through the ICU like a ghost, invisible, methodical, her movements economical as she checked lines and adjusted for pumps. 20 years at this hospital, and nobody saw her anymore. The younger nurses didn't make eye contact. The residents looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. She existed in the spaces between conversations, the silent observer who charted everything with a precision that bordered on obsessive. She'd chosen invisibility deliberately. It was easier that way. The morning shift had begun at 6:45, right on time, her badge clipped to scrubs that had faded from teal to the color of old denim after 1,000 washings. Her name tag was worn blank on one edge, a Margaret Walsh, RN, the letters still legible but softened, like the person wearing it. She moved from bed 1 to bed 2 to bed 3, checking ventilators, reviewing fluid balances, her hands steady as surgical lasers despite the tremor that had started in her left index finger 3 months ago. A tremor she ignored. A tremor that meant nothing. The antiseptic smell of the ICU mingled with floor wax as she paused at bed 12. Corporal James Chen lay on his back, his chest wrapped in white gauze that was already beginning to yellow at the edges. Shrapnel wounds from Syria. A young Marine, maybe 23, with a scar tissue beginning to form along his left temple where stitches had recently been removed. Margaret moved toward him with the same careful efficiency she brought to every patient, checking his oxygen saturation, 91%, adequate, and adjusting his pillow with hands that didn't shake. Not ever. Not in public. But something made her pause. The scar on his temple was in a shape she'd seen before. She'd seen it in the dark, in the dust, in the scream of a child who'd been 8 years old in Tikrit 2 decades ago. A child whose building had collapsed around him. A child she'd shielded with her own body during an ambush in the Jolan district. Margaret's breath caught for exactly 2 milliseconds. Then she continued her rounds. It couldn't be. The odds were impossible. She was looking for ghosts in scars. That was the problem with carrying trauma, you saw it everywhere. In every young face. In every wound that reminded you of wounds you couldn't save. "How are you feeling this morning, Corporal?" she asked, her voice pitched low and even. No inflection. No emotion. Just a nurse checking on a patient. He turned his head toward her slowly, wincing. "Like I got hit by an IED," he said. Then his eyes focused on her face, and something flickered there, recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so," Margaret said. She straightened his blanket. "Your pain level?" 4. 5 if I breathe too deep. "I'll let Dr. Sterling know." She made a note in his chart, 6:02 a.m., alert, oriented, pain managed, vital stable, her handwriting precise and impossible to argue with. Documentation that covered every angle. Documentation that couldn't be challenged. That was her gift. That was her curse. She documented everything because documentation was armor. From the nurse's station, Dr. Richard Sterling watched her move through the ICU. He didn't look up from his tablet as she passed, but he saw her. He always saw her. And what he saw was a problem. The billing anomalies had been easy to hide for the first 6 months. A phantom equipment charge here, an inflated procedure code there, a few extra rounds of imaging that never actually happened. Sacred Heart Hospital had loose accounting, administrators more concerned with politics than balance sheets, vendors who'd learned to look the other way, and a board that met quarterly and asked minimal questions. Sterling had been careful. Methodical. He'd carved out $87,000 in the first quarter alone, funneled through shell corporations and vendor kickbacks. But Margaret Walsh was the kind of nurse who noticed things. She charted in meticulous detail. Every supply used. Every medication administered. Every minute of equipment time. The kind of notes that could be cross-referenced against actual patient care versus billed patient care. The kind of documentation that, in the wrong hands, could unravel everything. Sterling sipped his coffee and watched her bend over the cardiac monitor in bed 7, her posture bent in that careful way she had, as if she was trying to take up less space. He'd read her personnel file. 20 years. Exceptional patient outcomes. 0 complaints filed against her. No drama, no family emergencies that required time off, no ambitions that threatened anyone. She was the kind of employee hospitals loved, reliable, quiet, competent, completely unremarkable. The kind of person nobody would miss if she suddenly became a liability. He made a mental note to check which patient she'd been caring for over the past month. He needed to understand the scope of what she might have noticed. The thought occurred to him that her documentation, the very thing that made her a good nurse, could also make her dangerous. Every line she wrote was a potential witness statement. The ICU quieted as morning rounds moved toward midday rhythm. Patients on ventilators wheezed their mechanical chorus. The heart monitors beeped in their staggered pattern, a digital metronome of lives being measured in oxygen saturation and blood pressure. Margaret moved through it all without speaking to anyone except her patients. She didn't eat in the break room where the younger nurses gathered to laugh and complain. She didn't participate in the small talk about husbands and children and vacation plans. During her lunch break, she locked herself in her sedan in the parking lot of Sacred Heart Hospital, parked in the same spot, BR 47, where she'd parked for 18 years. She sat with the engine off and the windows cracked open just enough to let the Norfolk heat bleed out. Under the passenger seat, locked in the trunk, were her boots. She didn't bring them inside. That would have been a mistake. That would have been asking someone to look closer, to wonder why a hospital nurse kept a pair of worn combat boots locked in her car. The leather was cracked now, the laces frayed, the treads still packed with sand from a desert she'd promised herself she'd never return to. She'd tried throwing them away once, 8 years ago, after Robert died. But she'd fished them back out of the garbage the same afternoon. Some things, she'd learned, couldn't be discarded. They could only be hidden. The boot sat in the trunk like a secret. Like a witness. Like proof of a woman who no longer existed. Margaret pulled out her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, herbal tea, and ate without tasting anything. Her hands were steady. They were always steady now. 20 years of hospital work had trained them into obedience. The tremor in her left index finger was mild today, barely noticeable. She pressed her thumb against her palm until it stopped. Her phone sat dark in her scrub pocket. No texts. No calls. Nobody needed her for anything outside of work. Her brother hadn't called in 3 years. Her nieces had lives she wasn't part of. Robert was dead. The Navy had moved on. The world had rewritten itself into a shape that didn't include her anymore, and she'd let it. Back inside, Sterling was making a call from his office on the 3rd floor. The door was closed. His voice was low and measured. "We need to move on the Walsh situation before she reviews the equipment orders," he said into the phone. Pause. A listening voice on the other end, someone Sterling clearly knew well enough to speak plainly to. "Yes, I'm aware of the documentation requirements. That's precisely why we need to act now. She's in bed 12 today, the Marine. By end of week, she'll have charted his entire intake summary, and if she pulls any cross-references." He let the sentence hang. What happened next didn't unfold immediately. It unfurled the way threats do in hospitals, not with announcements but with small, calculated decisions. The kind of decisions that sound reasonable when they're made in private offices behind closed doors. Sterling had influence. 3 members of the hospital's administrative council owed him referral kickbacks for sending private patients his way. The chief of nursing was a friend of his wife. The hospital's legal counsel consulted with him on medical liability cases and appreciated his discretion. He'd spent 7 years building a network of people who understood that some problems were better handled quietly. But he needed to move carefully with Margaret Walsh. She had no weak points. No financial desperation. No addictions. No compromised ethics that could be leveraged. She was untouchable by normal means. Which meant he'd have to create the problem himself. Margaret returned from her lunch break at 12:33 p.m. She clocked back in and moved toward bed 12 to check Corporal Chen's medications. The pharmacy had sent up his afternoon doses: morphine, prophylactic antibiotics, a stool softener. She logged each one into the electronic medical record with the same meticulous attention she gave everything. Corporal Chen's eyes were closed. She adjusted his feline and made a note about the slight increase in his wound drainage, nothing alarming, normal for day 2 of his admission, and moved on. From his office, Sterling opened a new email to the Director of Nursing. He began typing carefully, each word selected for maximum effect. The words he would choose would matter. They would plant seeds. They would start the process. And by the time Margaret Walsh understood what was happening to her, it would already be too late to stop it. But Margaret didn't know that yet. She was still invisible. Still safe in the spaces between conversations. Still moving through the hospital with her hand steady and her documentation meticulous and her worn combat boots locked in a car trunk where they couldn't betray her. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. Margaret stood at the medication cart on Tuesday morning, her hands moving with the precision of 2 decades of muscle memory, when Dr. Sterling's voice cut across the ICU like a scalpel. "Nurse Walsh." Not a greeting. A summons. She turned, her jaw already braced, knowing this was something different from the usual dismissals. Room 347 held the Morrison family, mother, father, 2 adult daughters clustered around a hospital bed where their youngest lay sedated with an infection ravaging her lungs. Dr. Sterling entered with 2 residents trailing like remeras behind a shark, his white coat pristine, his bearing the kind of arrogance that came from never being questioned. The Morrison family looked up, hope flickering across their faces. He was the ICU director. He was here to deliver good news. Instead, he turned to Margaret with a smile that showed too many teeth. Nurse Walsh, explained to the Morrisons why their daughter received her antibiotics 40 minutes late yesterday. His voice carried the tone of a man already certain of the answer he wanted to hear. Margaret's chart was perfect. She knew it was perfect. She'd logged the administration at 08 for 7 hours, checked it 3 times, documented the patient's response to the drug. But she felt the eyes of the Morrison family swing toward her like searchlights, suddenly suspicious, suddenly doubting the nurse they'd been thanking 5 minutes earlier. "Doctor, the medication was administered at. Are you contradicting me in front of my patients, Granny Nurse?" His voice dripped contempt. One of the residents actually flinched. Mrs. Morrison's hand tightened on her daughter's feline. "Perhaps your memory is failing along with your reflexes. Perhaps that's why you keep making these kinds of errors." Margaret took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their monotonous hum. The heart monitor beside the Morrison daughter beeped its steady rhythm, a sound Margaret had learned to read like a language. She felt the tear forming before she could stop it, felt it track down her cheekbone like a cold accusation. Her hands remained steady at her sides. She did not look away from Sterling's face. Instead, she wiped the tear away with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact, and spoke in a voice so quiet the residents had to lean forward to hear it. "I faced enemy fire with more honor than this." The room went absolutely silent. Sterling's smile faltered for a microsecond, just long enough for Margaret to see she'd landed something real, before he recovered it, hardening his expression into something uglier. "Written warning. See me after rounds." He turned and left, his resident scurrying behind him like pilot fish abandoning a dying shark. Mrs. Morrison reached out toward Margaret. "I'm so sorry, we didn't." Margaret simply nodded and excused herself, moving back out into the ICU corridor where the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms and nobody was looking at her anymore. The first humiliation had been delivered. It wouldn't be the only one. The break room at 1215 hours was where Margaret had eaten her lunch for 3 years. Corner table. Tuna sandwich. Unsweetened iced tea. She'd never been the kind of nurse who crowded the center, trading gossip and complaints. She'd always preferred the perimeter, the edges, the spaces where she could observe without being observed. Today, she sat down and opened her container with hands that showed no tremor, no hesitation. Nurse Jennifer glanced at Nurse Rodriguez. A look passed between them, the kind of look that carried information about social hierarchies and who had just been marked as expendable. Rodriguez stood first, her half-eaten salad abandoned on the table. "I have to check on my patient." She didn't. Her patient was stable and sleeping. But she left anyway, gathering her things with the kind of careful efficiency that said she was making a choice. Jennifer followed within 30 seconds. Then Nurse Morrison, no relation to the family in room 347, though Margaret noticed the cruel coincidence, stood and left without even making eye contact. Within 90 seconds, the break room had emptied like Margaret carried some kind of contagion. 6 people had been sitting there. 6 people had stood and walked out rather than remain at the same table with her. The motivational poster on the wall, a sunset with text reading "Teamwork makes the dream work," seemed to mock her with its cheerful permanence. Margaret ate her sandwich alone. Each bite was mechanical. Fuel. Nothing more. She'd eaten alone in far worse places than this. That afternoon, Sterling made his final move of the day. He posted the formal written warning on the unit bulletin board next to the shift schedule, where every staff member arriving for their rotation would see it. She caught sight of it when she came back from restocking the crash cart, a printed form with her name clearly visible, the language clinical and damning, persistent attitude problems and insubordination. Nurse M. Walsh placed under performance review. The night shift nurse, arriving early for handoff, stopped in front of the board and read it. Then she glanced at Margaret, a glance like pity, like distance, like the beginning of erasure. She said nothing and hurried past into the unit. Margaret stood in front of her own public execution and didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't let the second tear fall. Instead, she felt something crystallize inside her chest, not anger, but recognition. Recognition of a pattern she'd thought she'd left behind in Tikrit, in the desert where honor had meant something concrete. Recognition that there were predators everywhere, not just in combat zones, and that they recognized weakness the same way sharks recognized blood in the water. She was still standing there when her shift ended at 1900 hours. She drove through the rain toward the cemetery on the eastern edge of Norfolk, the wipers beating a rhythm against the windshield. Water hammered the parking lot as she walked toward Robert's grave, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet grass. The headstone was simple. Robert Malcolm Walsh. Husband. 1959 to 2019, she'd never told him where she'd served. Never told him about the missions, the choices, the lives she'd held in her hands and sometimes couldn't save. She'd told him she was in logistics. She'd lied with the same meticulous precision that Dr. Sterling was trying to weaponize against her. Rain streamed down her face as she knelt in front of the stone, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to save just one more. I tried to save one more and I failed again." The rain erased her words before they could fully form, and maybe that was mercy. Maybe that was the only honesty left in the world, the kind that washed away before anyone could hold it against her. She didn't know that lying in a bed 2 miles away, in an ICU she'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing, was a young Marine named James Chen. She didn't know that 22 years ago in Tikrit, in a firefight in the Jolin district, she'd shielded an 8-year-old boy named James with her own body while bullets chewed through the concrete around them. She didn't know that boy had joined the Marines at 17 because he'd never forgotten the scarred woman who'd held him together when everything was falling apart. She didn't know that everything was about to change. That night, rain continued to fall on Norfolk, washing the streets clean, erasing footprints, making the world look new. Margaret sat in her car in the cemetery parking lot and let the water drum against the roof like distant artillery. She'd survived worse than Dr. Sterling. She'd survived fire and shrapnel and impossible choices in languages she barely understood. But that didn't make Tuesday hurt any less. That didn't make the break room empty any less. That didn't make the public humiliation in front of a dying patient's family any less corrosive to the careful silence she'd constructed around herself. She didn't know that at Sacred Heart Hospital, in bed 12 of the ICU, a young Marine's fever was climbing. She didn't know that his lungs were beginning to fill with fluid from an infection that was becoming increasingly resistant to antibiotics. She didn't know that in exactly 72 hours, a 300-pound man high on methamphetamine would storm through those ICU doors swinging a tire iron, and that she would walk directly toward him instead of running away like everyone else. She didn't know that Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh was about to stop hiding. That the worn combat boots locked in her car trunk were about to come out of the dark. That the woman she'd spent 20 years trying to bury was about to save someone's life. Tuesday afternoon at 2:56 p.m., the ICU doors burst open with the force of a man who'd already made a decision about violence. He was 300 pounds of rage wrapped in a methamphetamine high, his t-shirt soaked through with sweat, his eyes the color of blown pupils and broken promises. He screamed in a voice like gravel in a cement mixer, high-pitched, raw, inhuman, that the military had poisoned his brother, that they'd injected something into Corporal James Chen to silence him, that this hospital was a cover for government murder. Margaret was updating Bed 14's medication chart when the sound registered. Not a code alert. Something worse. Something primal. The tire iron came next, swinging in a wide arc that caught the medication cart with the sound of metal screaming against metal. Glass vials exploded across the floor in a shower of amber and clear liquid. The smell hit immediately, antiseptic and alcohol and something chemical, sharp enough to make her eyes water. Every nurse in the ICU moved at once. Not toward the man. Away. Dr. Chen's wife grabbed her children and ran for the stairwell. A respiratory therapist dove behind a supply cabinet. The night shift supervisor was already on the radio to security, her voice climbing an octave with each transmission. A resident in a white coat backed toward the windows, both hands up like the gesture would stop what was coming. Margaret set down her pen. She didn't run. She didn't duck behind the nursing station. She didn't call for help or raise her voice or do any of the things a person is supposed to do when a 300-pound stranger with a tire iron is screaming about government conspiracies inside a locked medical unit. She walked directly toward him instead. Her gait was different now, not the careful, apologetic shuffle Dr. Sterling had spent 2 days mocking in front of the Morrison family. This was the walk of someone whose center of gravity had shifted, whose shoulders had pulled back, whose spine had remembered itself. Her hands hung loose at her sides like they already knew what was coming. "Step back," she said quietly. The man swung. The tire iron came at her head in a flat arc, the kind of swing that would shatter her skull against the tile, that would send her down and probably keep coming. Security was still 90 seconds away, she could hear the footsteps pounding up the stairwell, but they wouldn't make it in time. The hospital had decided on closed-circuit cameras instead of armed security on the ICU floor. Cost-saving measure. Dr. Sterling had approved it in a budget meeting 6 months ago. Margaret's left hand rose like it had done this 10,000 times before. She caught the iron at the wrist, redirected it past her left shoulder by rotating at the hip, and simultaneously drove her right elbow up into the man's joint. The movement was too smooth, too precise, too practiced to be anything but trained response. If there had been a security camera with a fast enough frame rate, the footage would have shown something like watching a blade cut water, clean, efficient, and almost too fast to follow. The tire iron fell from his grip and clattered to the floor with a sound like a ship's anchor hitting steel plating. Margaret pivoted, and 3 more movements happened in a blur, a redirect, a control, a takedown, and the man was face down on the tile, Margaret's knee on his spine, her voice dropping into the command tone she'd sworn never to use again, the one that had directed 73 personnel through a firefight in the Jolan district of Fallujah in 2004. "Stop fighting," she said. "You're safe. Your brother is safe." Her breathing was controlled. Steady. Not elevated. Not the breathing of someone who'd just survived a violent assault, but rather someone who'd just stepped out of a taxicab. Security arrived in the doorway, 2 officers in dark blue polo shirts, hands on pepper spray canisters. They stopped when they saw the 300-pound man already neutralized, Margaret kneeling on his back with the posture of someone who could hold him there indefinitely. "Secure him," Margaret said, releasing the man to their custody. Medical alert. Methamphetamine tox screen, psychiatric evaluation, full workup. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered in a voice that sounded like it had authority backing it, the kind of authority that didn't come from a name badge. But the real crisis was already screaming. Bed 12's monitor was shrieking, a high-pitched alarm that meant oxygen saturation dropping fast. Margaret's head snapped toward the sound like a turret rotating on ball bearings. The monitor read 68. Falling. Corporal James Chen was upright in his bed, eyes wide with panic, his chest heaving in the desperate breathing pattern of someone whose lungs were collapsing from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. His left lung had collapsed from the stress, from the physical exertion of trying to sit up during the chaos, from watching a 300-pound man swing a tire iron 10 feet from his bed. Air had accumulated in his chest cavity, pressing against his heart, collapsing his remaining lung function. Another 30 seconds and his heart would stop filling with blood. Margaret moved to his bedside before any doctor could emerge from wherever they'd fled. "Corporal, I need you to trust me," she said, and her voice had changed again, not commanding now, but something deeper. Something that sounded like experience. Like survival. Like someone who understood what it meant to live on the wrong side of an oxygen saturation number. She pulled supplies from the crash cart. 14-gauge angiocath. Alcohol prep pad. Her fingers found the landmarks on his chest, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with the precision of someone who'd done this before, not in simulation labs but in actual bodies, under actual fire, with sand in the seams of her uniform and the sound of small arms fire echoing off concrete walls. "This is going to feel like pressure," she said, prepping his skin with a motion that was economical, efficient, practiced. "Not pain. Just pressure. I need you to breathe through it." Her hands were absolutely steady. The needle went in. She felt the give, the slight resistance of tissue, the moment the needle's edge found the space between his ribs. A half-second pause. Then the sound that only happened when you'd gotten it right, the sharp hiss of air escaping, the sound of a pressure seal breaking, the whistle of his lung re-expanding as oxygen that had been accumulating in his chest suddenly had somewhere to go. The monitor began climbing immediately. 68, 72, 78, 84. His color returned like someone turning up the brightness on a photograph. His breathing eased from the desperate gasping of a drowning man to something close to normal. Margaret's breathing remained unchanged. She was still wearing her scrubs. Still wearing her employee badge hanging on a lanyard that said Margaret Walsh, nurse. Still looking like the invisible woman who'd moved through this hospital for 20 years, the one Dr. Sterling had dismissed as an aging liability in morning rounds, the one his written warning was probably still trying to find the right filing cabinet for in his office upstairs. What Dr. Sterling didn't know was that his filing cabinet was about to become irrelevant. He appeared in the ICU doorway at that exact moment, his phone already pressed against his ear, his face flushed with the kind of anger that only comes when someone else's crisis is interfering with your schedule. He watched Margaret remove the needle with the same steady hand she'd used to insert it, watched the monitor continue its climb toward normal oxygen saturation, watched Corporal Chen's color continue to improve, and his jaw tightened. "Yes, I need an emergency board meeting," Dr. Sterling said into the phone, his voice low and controlled and carrying the unmistakable tone of someone making sure his allies knew which direction the wind was blowing. "Tonight. We have a liability situation that requires immediate termination. That nurse in the ICU, Margaret Walsh, she just performed an invasive procedure without a physician order, without proper authorization. Reckless endangerment. Practicing beyond her scope. I'm documenting everything. We move fast, we move quiet, and we move before anyone can contradict the narrative." Margaret didn't hear him. She was focused entirely on the oxygen saturation number, on the rise and fall of Corporal Chen's chest, on the return of awareness in his eyes. She was focused on the job she'd been trained to do, the only job she'd allowed herself to do for the past 20 years, keep people alive, ask no questions, expect no recognition. She had no idea that recognition was already on its way. She had no idea that the man in bed 12 was looking at her face with an expression that had just shifted from panic to something else entirely. Recognition, yes, but also something that looked like memory, like understanding, like he'd just realized who was standing over his bed. The ICU was still in chaos. Still clearing. Still trying to process what had happened in the space of 90 seconds, a violent intrusion, a near tragedy, and a woman who'd responded to both with the calm of someone who'd made different kinds of decisions in different kinds of emergencies, a long time ago, in a place that most people only understood from news footage. Security was processing the 300-pound man, who was now secured to a stretcher and sedated. The other nurses were emerging from hiding, checking their stations, assessing damage. Dr. Sterling was still on the phone, still building his case, still unaware that the case against him was already being built elsewhere, by people who had access to things like medical boards and federal oversight and the kind of authority that didn't require a position at a hospital to wield. Margaret finished her assessment of Corporal Chen and made a note in his chart. Her handwriting was steady. Precise. Meticulous. Dr. Sterling had called that meticulous charting her greatest liability. He had no idea it was about to become his downfall. The emergency board meeting was called for 7 p.m. Dr. Sterling had moved with surgical precision, scheduling it in the administration conference room on the 3rd floor, far enough from the ICU that Margaret would have to climb stairs, walk corridors, and feel the weight of every step. The rain outside hammered the windows like applause nobody wanted. Margaret sat across from 3 board members whose names she recognized but whose faces she'd never truly studied. Dr. Bancroft from cardiology. Miss Hayes from finance. Dr. Conrad from administration. She knew, in the way ICU nurses know things without being told, that these 3 men owed Dr. Sterling something. Probably referral kickbacks. Probably a lot of them. The kind of arrangement that made a man untouchable, because if you touched him, you'd have to explain why you were accepting money from his private practice in the first place. Dr. Sterling sat at the head of the table. His tie was silk. His shoes were polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent ceiling lights like mirrors. He opened a folder. Margaret recognized her own medical charts, her own incident reports, her own notes printed on hospital letterhead, and began speaking with the clinical precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. Nurse Walsh engaged in physical confrontation with a patient's family member, he said, his voice steady as a metronome. She employed combat techniques. He paused for effect, letting the words settle like smoke, clearly beyond the scope of nursing practice. Then she performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. A needle decompression, I believe. Without orders. Without a doctor present. He looked at the 3 men. They nodded. They were already convinced. This constitutes reckless endangerment and practicing beyond her scope. Our liability exposure is significant. Margaret opened her mouth. The patient would have died without. I've already contacted your previous employers, Sterling interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a blade through silk. The Naval Medical Center in San Diego. The VA hospital in Los Angeles. Both express serious concerns about your judgment. Behavioral issues. Difficulty accepting direction. He gestured to a man sitting in the corner of the conference room, someone Margaret had not noticed until that moment. This is Mr. Halloway from Coastal Investigation Group. I hired him 2 days ago to conduct an independent review of your incident. Mr. Halloway nodded gravely. He looked like a man who investigated things, the way a knife looks like it cuts. It was what he was made for. I haven't spoken to anyone about my previous positions, Margaret said quietly. They volunteered the information, Sterling said. When I called asking about your reliability. The room went so quiet you could hear the building's air conditioning, a low mechanical sound like something breathing in the walls. Margaret realized, in that moment, that Sterling had done this before. Not to her, before her. This was a pattern. A method. He called references and suggested concerns and then listened while people confirmed what he'd planted in their minds like seeds. The human memory was unreliable. All it took was one phone call asking the right question. Did you ever worry she might be unstable? And suddenly, people remembered things that had never happened. The vote, Dr. Bancroft said, glancing at the other two men, seems clear. Ms. Hayes nodded. Terminated for cause. Effective immediately. Wait, Margaret said. Her voice came out steady, but there was no steel in it. There was only the voice of someone who had already lost. I was responding to a crisis. The patient's lung had collapsed. He needed. You're not a physician, Conrad said flatly. I'm a trained ICU nurse with. You performed a procedure that only a doctor should perform, Sterling said. In most hospitals, you'd be facing criminal charges. We're being generous. A security guard appeared in the doorway. Margaret hadn't heard him approach. He was carrying a cardboard box. Just a regular box, the kind that came with office supplies or shipping paper. Just a box. Effective immediately, Sterling said, you're terminated from Sacred Heart Hospital. Your access badge will be deactivated. Escort, please. The security guard stepped forward. He was a man Margaret recognized. She'd seen him at shift changes, at the coffee station, at the parking lot exit where he sometimes checked IDs. He would not meet her eyes as he handed her the box. She stood up slowly. The meeting was already over. It had been over before it started. Sterling had called her references and planted doubt. Sterling had hired an investigator who would write a report confirming what Sterling had already decided. Sterling had arranged this room, this time, these men, this moment, with the precision of someone disarming a bomb, except the bomb was her. She packed her belongings while the board watched. Her stethoscope. The photograph of Robert in a wooden frame, taken 30 years ago when they were both young and believed they could run from their pasts. The worn combat boots from the bottom of her locker, their laces frayed at the edges, their leather cracked like dried earth, their soles worn thin by thousands of miles that nobody here knew anything about. The security guard drove her to the parking lot. Not in his car. They walked. Her boots echoed against the pavement. When they reached her car, he placed the termination box on the trunk and said, I believe you know the way out. Not unkind. Just professional. Just someone doing his job, handing someone else's life to them in cardboard. She drove through the rain. Riverside Cemetery was south of Norfolk, past the shipping yards where the Elizabeth River reflected the city lights like broken glass. The rain had intensified, not a drizzle but a storm, the kind that made the world blur and made it impossible to see very far ahead. She parked and carried the box to Robert's grave, her boots sinking slightly into the wet grass, her footprints filling with rain before she'd even finished walking. The headstone was granite. Robert Maurice Walsh. 1962 to 2018, the dates carved in stone were the boundaries of a life. She knelt down, the wet grass soaking through her scrub pants, the rain running down her face like tears she couldn't quite manage. I tried to save just one more, she whispered. The rain was loud enough that she could speak and nobody would hear. Nobody was listening anyway. I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed invisible, I could make up for Tikrit. For all those we couldn't save. The words came out in fragments, sentences that didn't quite connect, the way people speak when they're alone and don't have to pretend to be coherent. But I'm still failing. I'm still the same person who couldn't save them. The Navy understood that. They gave me medals and called me a hero, but I knew the truth. I couldn't save enough people. So I came here to Sacred Heart. I thought if I just worked quietly, kept my head down, helped people one at a time, I could earn back something. Earn back my soul or my honor or whatever I lost in that desert. Thunder rolled overhead, a sound like artillery, a sound that made her flinch despite the decades of distance. You never knew where I served, she continued. I couldn't tell you. The nightmares were too bad. The sounds. The blood. The choices I made that I can't unmake. And now I can't even save one Marine without losing everything. They fired me. They called me a liability. They said I was dangerous. She placed her hand flat against the wet granite. It was cold. It was real. It was all she had. I walked away from the Navy because I couldn't do it anymore. But I brought it with me. I brought all of it. And now it's cost me this too. She sat there for a long time. Long enough for the rain to soak completely through her clothes. Long enough for her to stop being able to distinguish between the rain and her tears. Long enough for the parking lot lights to come on, their yellow glow cutting through the darkness like searchlights. But that wasn't the lowest point. The lowest point came the next morning. Wednesday broke grey and wet. Margaret drove back to Sacred Heart Hospital because she needed her final paycheck. Because even when they fired you, they had to pay you for the time you'd worked. She took the elevator to the administrative offices, signed the paperwork, and was turning to leave when she heard the shouting. The voice was coming from the ICU. A man's voice, raised in anger, speaking in a language she hadn't heard in 20 years but recognized instantly. Arabic. The words were violent. They were terrified. They were breaking against the glass partition like waves breaking against rocks. She moved without deciding to move. Her feet carried her toward the ICU. Her access badge had been deactivated, but a nurse was coming out and left the door open, and Margaret slipped through before it closed. The attacker from yesterday, the man with the tire iron, the man she'd disarmed, was conscious now. He was in bed 19, sedated but fighting the sedation, thrashing against restraints, and when he saw her, his eyes locked onto her face and his voice rose to a scream. "Al-Qaeda," he was shouting. "Al-Qaeda! The commander! You! The room froze. Nurses paused in their charting. A resident stopped moving. The cardiac monitor seemed to pause too, as if the entire ICU was holding its breath. From bed 12, Corporal Chen struggled upright despite the chest tube running from his side. His face was pale, his movements pained, but his voice cut through the chaos with the precision of someone trained to be heard over gunfire. "That's Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh," he said. "She's the reason I'm alive." The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret felt her hands begin to shake, not from fear or emotion, but from the shock of exposure of 20 years of invisibility ending in a single sentence spoken by a young Marine who shouldn't even know her name. She moved to the nurse's station on automatic, her muscle memory taking over. She found Corporal Chen's chart and pulled the intake form. Under emergency medical history, written in military shorthand she recognized from a different lifetime, was a single line, rescued by SCPO Walsh, Tikrit 2004, call sign Phantom 6. The noise from the helicopter rotors reached them before the doors opened. 3 men in naval uniforms walked into the ICU with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, the kind of bearing that came from having seen things that civilian hospitals never saw. The commander stepped forward, his eyes finding Margaret instinctively, as if he'd known exactly where she would be standing. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," he said. His voice was formal. It was loud enough for everyone to hear. Margaret turned slowly. Every eye in the ICU was on her. The attacker in bed 19 had gone silent, as if even he recognized that something was shifting. "I've got her," the commander said, his voice rising. "Senior Chief Walsh holds the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire." Dr. Sterling's office door opened. He stood in the frame, and Margaret watched the color drain from his face like water running from a cup. 2 silver stars, the commander continued, for combat valor in Tikrit and Fallujah. A nurse gasped. One of the residents took a step backward. The Purple Heart. After taking shrapnel while shielding coalition personnel. The commander paused, letting each medal settle separately into the consciousness of every person listening. Her call sign was Phantom 6. She led the rescue operation that saved 42 coalition lives during the Tikrit siege of 2004. A nurse began to cry. Margaret didn't know why. She was still looking at her trembling hands, still unable to comprehend that the invisible woman had become visible, and that the cost of visibility had arrived in the form of boots on tile and a voice that spoke of wars she'd buried. The sedated man in bed 19 opened his eyes on Wednesday morning, and in that singular moment, recognition flickered across his face like electricity finding ground. His restraints pulled taut as his body tensed, and he locked onto Margaret's face with the kind of stare that belonged to a different time, a different continent, a different lifetime. The words came out in Arabic, rough and broken through chemical haze, Al-Qaeda. The commander. His voice cracked on the second word like a man seeing a ghost that had been hunting him for 20 years. Margaret's hands froze. She didn't look up from the medication cart. She didn't acknowledge the words. She simply continued what she was doing, checking 4 lines, recording vital signs, with the same methodical precision she'd maintained for 2 decades. But her breathing had changed. Just barely. Just enough that someone trained to notice would have noticed. That someone was Corporal James Chen, struggling upright despite the chest tube running from his ribcage to a collection chamber that bubbled with each breath he took. Pain creased his face as he moved, but his voice cut through the ICU like a command, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh. "She's the reason I'm alive." He said it loud enough for nurses at the station to hear. Loud enough for the monitor to catch as background noise on the recording. Loud enough that the young Marine's words became fact the moment they left his mouth, hanging in the climate-controlled air of the intensive care unit like a declaration no one could take back. Margaret finally moved. She set down the medication cart with controlled precision and pulled Corporal Chen's file from the computer station. Her hands moved efficiently, one keystroke, then another, until his intake form appeared. And there it was. Not his civilian name. Not his Marine Corps service number. The intake form listed his emergency contact as Margaret Walsh, rank Senior Chief Petty Officer, and beside his name, handwritten by whichever ER nurse had processed him 72 hours ago, was the call sign, Al-Qaeda. The commander. A name he'd given her, a designation that meant something only in a language most Americans would never speak, in a conflict most people had already forgotten. The ICU fell silent. Not the natural quiet of machines and soft voices. The absolute silence of a room holding its breath. The doors burst open at 9:06 a.m. 3 men in Navy dress uniforms, blues pristine enough to cut glass, moved through the ICU with the kind of synchronized purpose that made space open up before them. The commander, early 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of jaw that had been carved from hickory, walked directly to the nursing station where Margaret stood updating charts. His bearing was unmistakable. Not a question in his posture. This was authority that had never needed to announce itself. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Elizabeth Walsh. His voice carried the weight of 1,000 formations, 1,000 deployments, 1,000 moments when lives depended on someone holding the line. Margaret turned. Her hands were steady. Her eyes met his without flinching. Bronze Star. He said it like a statement of fact. The other 2 officers moved to flank him, creating a 3-man perimeter in the middle of the ICU. Nurses watched from stations, phones forgotten. Silver Star. 2 silver stars. Each medal came as its own sentence, each one acknowledged with the faintest nod from Margaret. Purple Heart. Twice. The second Purple Heart landed differently. That was a wound that had almost ended everything, taken in a firefight outside Fallujah that Margaret hadn't spoken about in 20 years. And the Navy Cross. The silence after that last decoration was so complete you could hear the ventilator hissing its rhythm like mechanical prayer. The commander continued, his words precise and clinical, detailing classified missions in Tikrit that Margaret had buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they belonged to someone else. Rescue operations. 42 coalition lives extracted. Terrorist cells dismantled. The commander was speaking about a woman none of these nurses had ever met, cataloguing the kind of valor that didn't belong in an ICU in Norfolk, Virginia, but here it was, echoing off beige walls and fluorescent panels. Dr. Sterling had arrived sometime during the commander's briefing. Margaret hadn't seen him enter, but she felt the moment he understood. His face drained of color like someone had opened a valve in his chest. He stood near the doorway to administration, mouth open, completely unable to process that the woman he'd tried to destroy held a medal higher than anything he could imagine, had done things that required government secrecy just to protect the details. The CEO arrived at 10:15 a.m., summoned by a phone call from the Navy's JG officer. By 10:45, there was a hospital board meeting happening in the second-floor conference room. By 11:30, the legal team was requesting an emergency audit of all ICU billing records for the past 18 months, records Dr. Sterling had blocked access to with every procedural obstacle he could manufacture. The auditors found the first phantom charge at noon. A $47,000 cardiac monitoring system that had never been delivered. By 1 p.m., 7 more pieces of non-existent equipment. By 2 p.m., the scope became clear, procedure codes for treatments that had never happened, billing for surgeries that existed only as line items, inflated rates for equipment rentals padded by 300%. The scheme had been running for 4 years. The total came to $2,347,000. Dr. Sterling made phone calls to his network of administrators and referral kickback partners. No one answered. One administrator texted, "Consulted with my attorney," withdrawing from any further discussions. Another simply forwarded an email from his own legal team requesting immediate distance from Sterling's financial arrangements. At 3:13 p.m., FBI agents in dark windbreakers entered through the main lobby. They didn't approach quietly. They didn't minimize the presentation. They walked directly through the hospital atrium, past the gift shop and the cafeteria, directly toward the administrative corridor, and Margaret heard about it through the ICU network before they'd even made it to Sterling's office. Sterling saw them coming. He grabbed his briefcase, the same one he'd thumped on the conference table during Margaret's termination meeting, and headed for the side exit near the pharmacy. He was moving fast, head down, planning his exit strategy with the kind of tactical precision he'd never bothered to apply to his ethical obligations. The security guard was waiting at the exit door. The same guard who'd handed Margaret the cardboard box containing her personal items 2 days ago. His face was completely expressionless, the kind of calm that comes from watching injustice finally get its reckoning. "Dr. Sterling." The guard held out another cardboard box, this one empty except for his ID badge sitting at the bottom. "I believe you know the way out." Sterling took the box with shaking hands. His briefcase clattered to the floor. He reached down to grab it just as the FBI agents rounded the corner. One officer touched his elbow, light pressure, professional courtesy to a physician about to be arrested. "Dr. James Sterling? You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of medical records." The handcuffs clicked shut. Stainless steel biting into wrists that had never been restrained before, had never experienced physical consequences for the choices he'd made. Nurses at every station watched through windows as agents escorted him toward the main exit, his briefcase still lying on the floor near the pharmacy door, abandoned and irrelevant. Margaret didn't watch. She was in Corporal Chen's room, checking the air evacuation valve on his chest tube, confirming that his lung had fully re-expanded, that his oxygen saturation had stabilized at 97%. The medical work continued. The machine still beeped. The monitors still traced their electronic rhythms. The ICU kept functioning with the kind of invisible precision that Margaret had been providing for 20 years, the kind of heroism that happened with no one watching and no medals at the end. 3 months later, she returned to Sacred Heart as the new director of emergency services. The Navy had quietly influenced the national search. The hospital board had voted unanimously. No one dared object after everything had come to light. The worn combat boot sat in her office locker now, visible and honored, no longer hidden in the car trunk. The cracked leather that had walked through Tikrit, through deserts, through firefights and rescue operations, was where it belonged. Some mornings before shift, Margaret touched that cracked leather and let her fingers trace the dust still embedded in the creases, the sand from 20 years ago that refused to wash away. She'd tried so hard to become invisible. She'd run so far from that woman, that rank, that life. But some battles choose you, no matter how hard you run. They follow you across oceans and years and identity changes. They find you in hospital corridors when you're least expecting them, and they ask you to remember who you actually are. Corporal Chen recovered fully. He returned to active duty and sent her an email that read, "Thank you for saving me twice. Once in Tikrit when I was 8 years old and couldn't understand why an American officer cared enough to shield me from gunfire. And again on that Tuesday in the ICU. There's a reason I listed you as my emergency contact. There always has been." She kept that email in her personal file, the only proof that some of the lives she'd changed across 2 decades had actually mattered. Dr. Sterling's trial concluded with guilty verdicts on 14 counts. The federal judge showed absolutely no mercy. 3 years in federal prison. $2.4 million in restitution. Permanent revocation of his medical license. The local news ran a short segment about the trial's conclusion. Margaret saw the headline once and never searched for it again. She heard through hospital gossip that after serving his sentence, Sterling was teaching CPR classes at a community college for minimum wage, rebuilding his life from absolutely nothing, finally understanding what it meant to have everything taken away. She felt no satisfaction from that information. Just the recognition that justice was neither fast nor perfect, but it eventually arrived. The break room filled up when Margaret sat down for lunch yesterday. Every seat taken. Nurses asking questions about Tikrit, about combat medicine, about what it meant to carry that kind of weight for 20 years without letting anyone see the burden. She answered quietly, truthfully, without dramatizing any of it. That evening, visiting Robert's grave with fresh flowers, she knelt in the grass and spoke softly, "I stopped running, Robert. I stopped hiding. And I'm finally healing." Walking back to her car, she noticed the bumper sticker a nurse had placed on the unit board, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." She smiled, small, genuine, free, and for the first time in 2 decades, she wasn't measuring that smile against the cost of it. If this story of a hidden hero resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another tale of quiet courage exposed. Like this video if you believe that the bravest people often walk among us without fanfare or recognition. And comment below, have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd actually survived? Your stories matter. Thank you for watching.